Last time I discussed Brunetto Latini and Canto 15 of Dante's Inferno, and we're going to take the plunge now and go much deeper into hell, Canto 26 out of 34. And we're now in, you can almost call it the deepest rung of hell, which is the circle of fraud. To remind you, we have sort of three categories of sins in hell. The sins of incontinence, or you can call them lack of self-control. We talked here about Paolo and Francesca in Canto 5. Then the sins of violence, and violence against others, violence against self, violence against God and nature. And we talked last time about Brunetto Latini. But now we're moving into the circle of fraud. And in the circle of fraud, you have two types of fraud. You have simple fraud and complex fraud. Complex fraud is distinguished from simple fraud in that simple fraud is taking advantage of somebody to achieve a goal that is beneficial to you, but not to them. You're deceiving them by drawing them into your, you may say, corrupt scheme, and you're trying to pull a fast one over them in a malevolent and evil way. But complex fraud takes this to a whole new level, and we'll talk about complex fraud later, taking advantage of people with whom you have a special trust, to whom you owe a certain deep bond of obligation, and to betray that is, you may say, an even deeper type of fraud. But now we're going to talk about simple fraud, although as you'll see, simple fraud does not mean minor fraud. And there are two very important cantos we're going to sort of take together in the Inferno. This is Canto 26 and Canto 27. And in each of them, we meet a single major figure that dominates the canto. In 26, we meet a classical hero named Ulysses. Now, Ulysses was kind of the Roman name. The same figure, the same person in ancient Greece was called Odysseus. And you might remember Odysseus. Odysseus is the hero of Homer's Odyssey. And so right away, we have a very interesting question. Why would somebody, Odysseus, who is presented as very intelligent and very capable and very resourceful, and somebody whose homecoming is the subject of Homer's Odyssey, and clearly Odysseus is the hero of the Odyssey, how can somebody like that be right here pretty deep in Dante's hell and presented as a fraud? Now, in some ways, Dante, as in a very Dante-esque fashion, treats Ulysses. I'm going to call him Ulysses because that's what Dante calls him. That's the Roman name. By the way, the Romans renamed a number of the Greek heroes and also a number of the Greek gods. And so if you're a classical scholar, very often when you're talking about a god, one of the gods, pagan gods from classical antiquity, you need to know the Greek name and the Roman name for the same god. And but Dante, in treating Ulysses, has this discussion of fraud. And as you're going through it, a question keeps running through your mind. Where's the fraud? Where's the fraud? And that's what makes this canto so tantalizing, is it Dante makes you think. And it's almost like he makes you read the next canto in which you're going to meet a completely different figure. Again, this is sort of Dante's style of moving between classical antiquity to the present. And the present is, of course, his present, where we will meet a character named Guido da Montefeltro, a political figure right out of Tuscany. And now that guy, we very clearly will see what his fraud is because he describes it in rather riveting detail himself. But the point I'm trying to make is it's almost like you have to recognize that Ulysses and Guido da Montefeltro are in the same circle. And then you have to ask, what is it that they have in common? And that's going to help you to understand what Ulysses' fraud is. And so this is where Dante is asking his reader to really think. And but we'll get into the canto probably next time, I want to just say a few introductory words about Odysseus. Because this is a background that not only Dante knew, but Dante would sort of expect his readers to know, and his contemporary readers would know. So Odysseus is a figure who is present in the Iliad and in the Odyssey. Odysseus is the guy who thought up the clever stratagem, the clever technique of the Trojan horse. You remember that toward the latter part of the Trojan War, the war was kind of at a standstill. It was going back and forth. Even though the Greeks had a much bigger invading army, they were not able to get into Troy. The walls of Troy held. And so Odysseus came up with this idea, since the Trojans were superstitious, well, I mean, the Greeks were too. The idea was to create this massive totemic horse and present it almost like a kind of peace offering on the part of the Greeks. And the Trojans were expected to then pull the horse into their city, which they did. The Greek ships actually withdrew. The Trojans thought the Greeks are gone. They've essentially left us this peace offering, the horse. The Trojans begin to celebrate, but of course concealed in the horse are all these Greek soldiers. And so at night when the Trojans are asleep, the Greek soldiers come out. They not only kill the guards, but they open the gates. The Greek army, which is now assembled for the purpose, swarms in. So this was all Odysseus's idea. And Odysseus was regarded, this is Ulysses, Ulysses, regarded as the cleverest of the Greeks. In fact, after the Trojan War, the Greeks awarded a prize to their greatest soldier, and it came down between Odysseus and a guy named Ajax. Now, Ajax was sort of the straight-out fighter on the battlefield, the guy who killed the most people in battle. But the Greeks decided to award the prize to Odysseus because they felt that in this particular case, it was cunning rather than brute force that produced the best result. And in fact, Ajax committed suicide out of his shame and anger at being passed over by the Greeks. And there's a whole play in Greek tragedy called Ajax about exactly this. But so here you have this Homeric hero, this hero of ancient Greece, Odysseus. And yet, interestingly, Dante takes a different view of him. And Dante does it not really by going back and questioning or attacking the circumstances or reinterpreting and saying, oh no, in coming up with the Trojan horse, Odysseus did this underhanded tactic, or that Odysseus, or trying to give a different coloring to Odysseus's actions. No, Dante does something kind of spectacular and you may almost say original. What he does is he writes a new chapter of Odysseus's life. He basically says, this is all we know about Odysseus. No problem. I'm on board with it. But you didn't know that when Odysseus came home, when he returned to his family, when he reunited with his wife Penelope, when he reunited with his aging father, when he reunited with his son Telemachus, after all that happened, something else happened, which Dante, I'm going to tell you about. So as far as we know, Dante invents a kind of addition to the Ulysses story. And that becomes the key to understanding what is it about Ulysses toward the end that made him such a fraud.